I campaigned for him. I went right out of the Republican Party. I was still a Republican, still am today, but I campaigned for Barack Obama.
We gave him a
And
Nobel Peace Prize because of his wonderful speeches. We fell
that
for it
that
as well, I guess.
that
Yeah.
became his single mark of positive nature. He could give a good speech. But I will say, when I met with him in the Roosevelt Room in November 2015, which would have been the last year of his second term, the first words out of his mouth to me and General Paul Eaton, who was sitting to my left, were, "There's a bias in this town toward war."
Yeah.
And then he gave us a disquisition on how he got essentially talked into doing Libya by, he didn't say this, but we knew it, two ladies, Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton. And John Kerry was sitting right beside him, his then Secretary of State. And we asked ourselves, General Eaton and I, when we walked out into the West Wing reception room, we just had a photo op with him in the Oval Office. We walked out of the West Wing reception room and we said, was he talking to us, to John Kerry, or himself? And the general looked at me and said, I think all three. I said, I think you're right. I think you're right. Because Kerry at that moment, you may recall, was advocating for U.S. ground forces in Syria. And so the president took that opportunity to not only say he'd learned something in 7 years, there's a bias in this town toward war, you bet, Mr. President, but he also was telling Kerry to shut his mouth in that indirect way in that meeting. And you could tell it from John Kerry's face. So Obama got fooled by a lot of people, and he got fooled, I think, most profoundly by his own confidence in himself, and it didn't work. I saw the same thing happen to Powell. Powell thought that he could handle anything, and he found out he couldn't.
So Obama was not optimistic about Libya, but it was Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton that swayed him.
I think that was the import of what he was saying. You remember he dispatched Samantha to the UN and got her out of Washington. And of course, John Kerry became the Secretary of State. I don't think he was happy with either one. I think he thought they had sold him a bill of goods, especially with regard to Libya. And those remarks that Hillary made rankle with him as much as they did with me, because we talked offline. We saw, he died. I said those are the most impolitic diplomatic remarks I'd ever heard uttered by an American supposed diplomat.
Yeah, accompanied by that chuckle, of course.
Yeah.
No, that was not
I think she had rehearsed those lines. I think
yeah.
she was fully intent on saying that somewhere powerful in her interview.
We came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.
Appearing like an Iron Lady, perhaps. I'm not sure where she was going with this.
Well, she was running for president. She'd been running for president ever since she left the first ladyship. And, I had to deal with her to a certain extent when I would go to the wrap-up meetings at the State Department, because the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, Paul Kelly, was a good friend of mine, former Marine, good friend of mine. So I would go to the wrap-up meetings when I could in the evenings, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and I would listen to what his deputy secretary said about the Senate and the House. And I would listen to the deputy for the Senate talk about how Hillary Clinton was one of the people in the Senate who could cross the aisle and deal with the other side very effectively. And I got this impression that, well, maybe she's a pretty good senator. And then later on in that time, about a year and a half later, I began to listen a little closer to what Jim was saying about the Senate. And I began to understand that she was on her track. She was running for president. And I think she got the blow of her life when she didn't get elected.
But I remember there were also being stories, it was in the New York Times, about the Obama. He wanted to withdraw from the wars, I think Iraq especially, but then his appointees from I forgot which think tank which dominated his administration.
Center for New American Security.
Yeah, that they were able to sway him into continuing that war as well. Did you have any insights on this?
One reason they did it, Glenn, was because they knew what we were doing to build ISIS. We made ISIS. We made Daesh. We took out Abu Zarqawi. We took him out. He was the main man. What flowed into his death was Iraqi Sunni leadership, mostly from the Iraqi Republican Guard, who knew about artillery, knew about armored warfare, knew about how to coordinate air power. They were military, and they were pretty competent military. They were made incompetent in many respects by the leadership of Saddam Hussein and how he orchestrated and kept them on a leash all the time. But they weren't that bad a military, and they had good Soviet equipment. Well, what they did was make a deal with the CIA and with these remnants of, well, it was everything from Al-Qaeda to you name it. It was a throw-together group of terrorists that Zarqawi had put. Zarqawi was a poison maker up in the mountains, and suddenly he came down. I think he was a Kurd, if I remember right. Anyway, he came down, and Saddam Hussein didn't even like him. He was so bad. I learned all of this when I was getting Powell ready for the UN presentation. And they put together this organization that was going to, when the U.S. got out of Iraq in a way that they could, going to take Syria, going to take northern Iraq, going to, you know, everything, the caliphate. You know, they wanted a caliphate. Well, that was not what the Republican Guard members wanted. When you saw these guys firing accurate artillery rounds, when you saw them maneuvering tanks and everything, those weren't people who'd come from Al-Qaeda or some other terrorist organization. Those are Republican Guard members from Iraq. So the CIA helped create that entity and flowed them into Syria so that we could destabilize Assad. We got a shock when the insurgency started in Iraq. The full plan was to go on to Syria. And we thought, the military thought, that Assad would back down immediately. All we'd have to do would be roll a few tanks across the border and he'd back down because he'd seen what happened to Saddam Hussein. Well, the insurgencies developed so fast, Rumsfeld had to nix that. So we didn't go on to Syria. Wes Clark will tell you that we were going to Syria and then to Iran, and maybe some places else too. But all I ever heard was the briefing on Syria. And I also heard the briefing when we stood down. We weren't going into Syria and part of that was because Tommy Franks had not listened to Colin when Colin had told him, you need at least 250,000 troops. And if you're going to do all this, you need at least 250,000 troops. And you had the experience of the first Gulf War, where we had 600,000 plus. A lot of other people played in that one, including the Syrians and the French and the Saudis. And Tommy finally got angry at Colin, and he said back to him, listen, Rumsfeld was going to give me 50,000 total. I'm glad I got 160,000. And then Rumsfeld left that division hanging out there in the ocean for so long, 16,000 men, that was going to come down through Turkey, but the Turks balked at the last minute and said, no, you can't do that. You can't come in from the north. So we had to ship them around, and they stayed at sea for a long time. Rumsfeld wouldn't let them come ashore because he wanted to be seen as the man who done Saddam Hussein with as few troops as possible, and then do Bashar al-Assad too, because it was all shock and awe. Didn't work. And so there we were, you know, thumb in mouth and no Syria going. And we developed an insurgency with the CIA. And long story short, we had to go back and fight our own developments. It was so bad, Glenn, that we actually had Marines shooting at CIA officers and CIA officers shooting at Marines in Syria because the one didn't know the other one was doing what they were doing. The CIA was working with Al-Qaeda too.
When did they get out of control, though? Because I can see, the American intelligence agencies building up these jihadist groups as an instrument in a proxy war. But when did the U.S., I guess, lose control over them and begin to attack them?
Well, when we had to come back, and they looked like they were going to make some significant progress, and we didn't think David Petraeus had told the president again and again and again that his training, remember, he started out as a 2-star, as the head of Minstiki, the training command in Iraq. And he was telling the president on civets almost every week that everything was copacetic, that all these people were getting really well trained, and they were going to be capable of not only internal security, but also external security for Iraq. this in progress to our leaving eventually. Well, I was getting reports from my spy on the ground in Iraq that the AWOL rate in these battalions was sometimes as high as 30%. And I was getting other reports that said they couldn't shoot straight and they weren't all that good as soldiers. So, well, Petraeus was giving glowing reports back to the president. So we thought that the military Petraeus had been largely responsible for training and given such glowing reports to the president about was going to be able to handle whatever was left of any insurgency or whatever. And I'm not even sure the conventional military, the right hand, knew what the CIA, the left hand, was doing completely. So we had to go back because they became ground taking and ground holding units. And so we had to get, Obama had no choice. He had to send forces back into Iraq because the Iraqi army couldn't handle it. And they begged him to come back, which was really kind of rare. They wanted us out, and then to beg us to come back, that meant that they really did understand that their military was not competent to handle that. I mean, you're talking about a bunch of people who got together, trained a little bit, Republican Guard behind them and helping them, lots of equipment, lots of ammunition, lots of artillery and everything. But still, Iraq had the equivalent, but they were frightened. And so they called us back in again, and we've been there pretty much ever since. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, and it's partly a nightmare because the empire doesn't know what it's doing from day one to day two. It's got so many people involved in the soup that it doesn't have any time to eat the soup.
So, do you have any information on the ground what's going on in Syria? Because this is, I guess, the United States, wanted to use Jolani and his henchmen to put pressure and weaken the position of Assad. But did they really want him to end up where he's now, ruling over Syria? This is, I mean, can he be civilized or managed? This seems like such a the way he was, have a bounty on his head, and next day, we go to, to cheer him on for creating a new democratic Syria. It's just it becomes very cartoonish after a while. Like this can't have been their first pick, I guess.
Some indication of how chaotic this was going to be occurred when Israel was really taking some losses, but nonetheless pounding Hezbollah. And all of a sudden, Netanyahu was asked by us to stop and to get ready for other action. And that other action, of course, was, and we told him this, was Syria. He was more than happy to do that. So he put an economy of force, holding force type element into Lebanon. And anyway, the ceasefire was coming about at that time, partly because of this. And he plunged into Syria. So we thought that Netanyahu, coveting as much of Syria as he possibly could get his hands on, and he was pushing well beyond the ski resort, the Mount Hermon, I think it's called, whatever, and well beyond the Golan that was already occupied into the southern Golan and on into Lake, River, Reservoir, and other places that he was investing because they want water. They want water wherever they can find it. That's one reason they want to stay in Lebanon. So Netanyahu joined the fray and became our tool in Syria to counter Erdogan, because we were really worried about, and we were talking to Erdogan, but we were worried about what he was doing and what he was saying in the talks. He was saying that all he wanted to do is take care of that element of the Kurdish population in Syria that was giving him trouble, and then he would be happy. He'd be pleased, and he wouldn't invest Syria anymore with troops. And Netanyahu was concerned too. You may recall Netanyahu and Erdogan met to talk about it. I'm not sure what they determined, but I think they gave themselves a division of labor, and Israel said it would continue to bomb everything that even looked like it might be a piece of ordnance in Syria, including in Damascus, which they've done several times. And they would take care of anything that needed to be taken care of if this guy moved in a way that looked like he was going to be inimical to either Erdogan's or Israel's interests, which Israel has done. They've had a couple of pretty vicious firefights with the IDF, his troops have. Each case, his troops have given a good showing, but they've been defeated by the IDF with some significant casualties. That's one reason Trump is pulling us out. But you'll note that he said he was pulling us out 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we still aren't gone. We still got about 1,000 troops there, and they're kind of lingering. But it's a mess. Syria's a mess, but Israel is making hay in that mess. And I suspect you're not going to see Israel, if it stays together as a state, which is becoming increasingly a question, never leaving Syria again. They'll have quite a significant stretch of water-rich territory inside Syria, beyond the Golan Heights.
So when before the Turkish-backed jihadists invaded Syria, this peace deal, which was all a ceasefire, which was reached between Israel and Lebanon or Hezbollah. This was, you're saying this was coordinated with the United States?
Yes, it was. If you remember, Lloyd Austin was standing on the border with his equivalent in the IDF. I forget the general's name now, but he was standing there and he was saying, this is going to stop. We're going to have a ceasefire, and we're going to have delineated lines and all this, and this will no longer be a component that diverts Israeli soldiers from other things that they need to do, meaning Gaza, I guess. And then I found out that Austin didn't necessarily lie, but he knew that that wasn't the case, because he knew what was going to happen, and he knew that the ceasefire was coming about because we wanted Israel to, protect our six, as Assad was either toppled or fought fiercely back. And that was the reason that the ceasefire came about as quickly as it did, not because Austin and Netanyahu wanted it to,